what it was like to face a lion in the Roman Colosseum, what Christians did before death and you did not know 50,000 people screaming, scorching sun, sand stained with dried blood, and you there, barefoot, weaponless, hearing the roar of an animal you cannot see. This was the last scenery that thousands of Christians beheld in ancient Rome. But what happened before that moment, in the hours, the days, the dark cells beneath the arena, is almost never told. And it is exactly there that the most impressive part of this story lies. The Colosseum was not just an amphitheater. It was a machine of spectacle designed to impress and terrify in equal proportions. Inaugurated in the year 80 after Christ, under Emperor Titus, the building had the capacity to accommodate between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. Its stands rose to nearly 50 meters in height, the equivalent of a 15-story building. The central arena measured 83 meters in length by 48 meters in width, covered by a layer of coarse sand that absorbed blood and facilitated cleaning between spectacles. The word arena comes from the Latin for sand. The name already stated its function. But the true engineering of terror was not in public view. Beneath this surface existed an invisible world. The hypogeum, as it was called, consisted of 2 underground levels with more than 80 vertical shafts and a network of corridors that extended for nearly 600 meters. There stayed the animals, the gladiators, the scenery equipment, and the condemned. Elevators operated by ropes and pulleys could make a lion appear in the center of the arena in seconds. The effect was theatrical. The fear was real, and the Christians knew every detail of this system even before being thrown into it. The Christians who arrived at that place did not come from conventional trials. During periods of more intense persecution, especially under Nero, Domitian, Decius, and Diocletian, an anonymous denunciation, the testimony of a disaffected neighbor, or the public refusal to sacrifice to the Roman gods was enough. The process was summary. The sentence, almost always the same: damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Think of what it meant to receive this sentence. There was no appeal. There was no technical defense. There was no second chance. The accused was transferred directly to the cells of the amphitheater, where they would wait days or weeks until their name was included in the programming of the games. The Roman calendar provided for more than 170 days of public spectacles per year. There was always room for one more execution. The question was never if, but when, and the wait was part of the punishment. In the underground cells, the darkness was almost total. Small openings in the ceiling let in beams of light that barely illuminated the face of the person next to them. The smell was a mixture of damp straw, human waste, and the unmistakable odor of wild animals. Lions, leopards, bears, and bulls were kept in nearby cages, sometimes separated from the prisoners only by iron bars. The roar of a hungry feline echoed through the corridors at any time of day or night. There was no way to truly sleep. Roman guards made constant rounds. Each cell was locked with reinforced wooden bars and bronze locks. Chains bound the ankles of the most dangerous prisoners or those most valuable for the spectacle. Escaping was mathematically impossible. Recorded attempts always ended the same way: immediate capture and early execution, usually by sword, without the dubious honor of the arena. Those who tried to escape lost even the right to die before the public. The food was calculated to weaken: hard bread, water, and occasionally a thin grain broth. Not out of economy, the empire had resources to spare, but by strategy. Weakened prisoners offered less resistance. There was also a calculation of spectacle. A thin and fragile condemned person contrasted more dramatically with the muscular beast that would attack them. The visual inequality was part of the entertainment. Every detail was thought out to maximize the impact on the audience. But there was something that Rome could not control. The waiting time varied enormously. Some prisoners waited only 3 or 4 days. Others remained in the cells for more than a month, depending on the programming of the games and the quantity of condemned available. Uncertainty was part of the psychological punishment. Not knowing when one would be called meant living every dawn as if it were the last. The sound of footsteps in the corridor could be the meal of the day or the final call. There was no way to distinguish until the door opened. Some prisoners went mad before reaching the arena. Others attempted suicide, biting their own tongues until they bled, hitting their heads against the stone walls, refusing any food until the body collapsed. The guards had orders to prevent these premature deaths. The spectacle demanded living victims. To die before the time was to rob the public of the promised entertainment. Among the condemned were all types of people: highwaymen, army deserters, rebellious slaves, prisoners of war from distant provinces. But the Christians formed a category apart. They were not there for crimes against persons or properties. They were there for crimes against the gods. And that changed everything. Roman logic was simple and brutal. The empire functioned under the protection of a divine pantheon. Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and dozens of other divinities guaranteed the prosperity of Rome in exchange for sacrifices and rituals. Refusing to participate in this system was more than a religious offense. It was political treason. The Christians, by declaring that there was only one God and that Jesus was the only Lord, denied the divinity of the emperor himself. In Roman terms, this was equivalent to terrorism, and terrorists deserved public deaths. What happened then in the final hours before the arena? The accounts that survived come from diverse sources: letters from bishops, acts of martyrdom, testimonies preserved by Christian communities, and even observations by Roman historians. The pattern that emerges is surprising. While other prisoners screamed, bargained, or tried to bribe guards, the Christians did something different. They gathered. Even forbidden from practicing their faith, even constantly watched, they found ways to pray together. They sat in circles in the darkest corners of the cells. They spoke in low voices, almost whispers. Some knew entire psalms by memory, especially Psalm 23, with its words, about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Others repeated phrases from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus warns that his followers would be delivered to courts and scourged, but that the Spirit would speak for them in that hour. The guards did not understand. There was something disconcerting about this calm. Roman administrative documents record the difficulty of the soldiers in comprehending that behavior. A memorandum from the 2nd century mentions Christian prisoners who sang hymns to their God as if they were at a banquet, not in a dungeon. The phrase was written with contempt. But behind the contempt, there was a genuine unease. How could someone sing knowing they would be torn apart in a few hours? The hymns were not improvised. Many Christian communities had already developed specific chants for moments of persecution. Some were based on the Hebrew Psalms, adapted into Greek or Latin. Others were original compositions that circulated by word of mouth among house churches. A preserved fragment speaks of crossing the fire without burning and overcoming the lion by the blood of the lamb, references that the Roman guards did not understand, but which for the Christians had profound meaning. The lamb was Jesus, sacrificed in Jerusalem decades earlier. The blood was both his and theirs. The connection was direct. It was not naivety, nor denial of reality. The Christians knew exactly what awaited them. Many had watched public executions before being arrested. They knew the procedure step by step. They knew they would be led through a narrow corridor to an iron door. They knew the door would open to the blinding light of the Mediterranean sun. They knew the crowd would explode in screams when they saw them enter. They knew that on the other side of the arena, a hungry animal would already be provoked to attack. There was no mystery about the fate. The only question was how to face it. And there, in the dark underground, they prepared themselves in the only way they knew. They prayed. They did not pray to be saved, at least not from physical death. They prayed not to deny the faith under torture. They prayed that fear would not dominate them. They prayed that their testimony, even in agony, would say something to those watching. Some documents mention Christians who fasted voluntarily in the final hours, refusing the last meal offered by the guards. They wanted to enter the arena on an empty stomach, as a form of additional sacrifice. The body was already condemned. The soul was not. Others said goodbye in ways that shocked the Romans present. Confessions of sins were made aloud before cellmates. Small offenses were forgiven. Old grudges were dissolved in minutes. There are records of Christians who declared specific forgiveness to those who had denounced them to the authorities, frequently neighbors, co-workers, or even family members who wanted to rid themselves of problems with the state. This act of explicit forgiveness was incomprehensible to the Roman mentality. How could someone absolve the person directly responsible for their death? Consider the psychology of this moment. You are in a dark cell, chained, hearing wild animals roar a few meters away. You know that in a few hours you will be torn apart before a crowd that will applaud every blow, and you choose to spend your last moments forgiving the one who put you there. For the Romans, based on honor, vengeance, and reciprocity, that was madness. For the Christians, it was the literal fulfillment of the words of Jesus on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Then the moment arrived. A Roman official descended to the cells with a list in hand. The names were called one by one. The chosen ones were unchained and led through an ascending corridor toward the arena. The light increased gradually, the noise as well, first a distant murmur, then a human roar that rivaled that of the animals. 50,000 voices merged into a single sound wave. The door opened. The condemned entered barefoot onto the hot sand. Most wore only a simple tunic, sometimes, already torn by the days of captivity. No weapons, shields, or any protection. In some executions, the Christians were tied to wooden posts driven into the sand, unable to move. In others, they were left free to run, not as mercy, but as additional entertainment. The crowd liked to see the prey try to escape. The chase was part of the show. On the other side of the arena, the handlers opened the cages. The animals used in the executions of Christians were not chosen at random. African lions were the most prestigious, brought from regions like Numidia, present-day Algeria, at a cost equivalent to the annual salary of a centurion. An adult male lion weighed between 190 and 250 kilograms, the equivalent of 3 average-sized Roman men. Their canines measured up to 8 centimeters. A single bite could crush a human skull as if it were a ripe fruit. But the empire did not use only lions. Leopards were faster and more unpredictable, capable of jumping distances of up to 6 meters in a single impulse. Brown bears, imported from the forests of Germania, were especially feared for their brute strength. A paw strike could tear the arm off an adult man. Wild bulls were used for variation, sometimes with horns heated in braziers to cause burns in addition to piercing wounds. Roman creativity for cruelty seemed to have no end. The animals were kept fasting for 2 or 3 days before the games. Hunger was part of the training. Some were provoked with spears and torches in the preceding hours to ensure they entered the arena in a state of maximum fury. The confrontation was not a fight. It was an execution choreographed to look like entertainment. The cost of maintaining these animals was astronomical. A single lion consumed about 7 kilograms of meat per day, the equivalent of what a poor Roman family ate in an entire week. The animals were transported from distant provinces in special ships, with reinforced cages and dedicated teams of handlers. Many died during the weeks-long journey across the Mediterranean. Those who survived arrived stressed, aggressive, and unpredictable, exactly what the organizers wanted. The logistics behind each spectacle involved hundreds of people: hunters in the provinces, maritime transporters, specialized handlers, veterinarians, operators of the hypodium elevators, all to ensure that, at the right moment, a wild animal would emerge in the arena ready to kill. Rome invested fortunes in death. There was also a hierarchy of deaths that few know. Common criminals were executed during the midday interval, when part of the public left for lunch and the stands were half empty. The Christians, being considered special enemies of the state, frequently received prime times, in the early afternoon, when the stands were full and attention was at its maximum. It was an inverted honor. The more hated the condemned, the better the time of their execution. Rome wanted everyone to see what happened to those who defied the gods. What did the spectators see then when a Christian entered the arena? Most expected despair. Screams, pleas, frantic attempts to escape. This was part of the usual script, but reports indicate that frequently something completely different happened. Some Christians walked to the center of the arena with firm steps, as if they were entering a temple. Others knelt immediately, in a position of prayer, ignoring the animal that approached. There are records of condemned who sang hymns aloud, audible even over the roar of the crowd. A document from the 2nd century describes a woman named Blandina, martyred in Lyon, who repeated only one phrase while being attacked: "I am a Christian, and nothing evil is done among us." She was suspended on a post and exposed to the beasts. The animals did not attack her immediately. The organizers had to remove her and bring her back on another day. When she finally died, after days of varied tortures, the crowd was more disturbed than entertained. This posture disconcerted the entire system. The objective of public executions was twofold: to eliminate threats to the state and to demonstrate the absolute power of Rome over its enemies. The condemned should beg. They should humiliate themselves. They should serve as a negative example for anyone who thought of defying the empire. When this did not happen, something broke in the script. The execution lost part of its purpose. Roman historians like Tacitus and Pliny the Younger mention in their works the strangeness caused by Christian behavior. Pliny, in a letter to Emperor Trajan around the year 112, describes the Christians as people of excessive and perverse superstition, but admits to not having found among them real crimes beyond obstinacy. Tacitus, writing about the persecutions of Nero after the fire of Rome in 64 after Christ, observes that the extreme cruelty against the Christians began to generate compassion in the population, not because they were innocent, according to him, but because the punishment seemed disproportionate to the crime. Compassion was a problem. Rome did not want martyrs. It wanted a deterrent. It wanted fear to spread through the streets and silence any dissent. But every execution that should have silenced the faith ended up generating more questions. What belief is this that makes someone die singing? The question had no easy answer, and unanswered questions spread. Observe what happened after the executions. The bodies were removed by specialized slaves, dragged with metal hooks so as not to contaminate the sand with excess blood. There was a quick interval for new condemned to enter. Efficiency was a priority. There was no official burial for the executed. The remains were frequently thrown into common pits outside the city walls, along with domestic waste and animal carcasses. The intention was clear: to deny the Christians any posthumous dignity. Without an identifiable body, there would be no tomb. Without a tomb, there would be no place of veneration. Without veneration, the memory would die along with the person. It was a logical plan. It was not what happened. Free Christians who had not yet been denounced risked their own lives to recover the remains of the martyrs. They went at night to the disposal sites when the guards were less attentive. They searched for bones, fragments of clothing, anything that could be identified. They bribed slaves and guards with the little money they had. They transported the findings in secret, under cloaks and straw baskets, to catacombs, underground tunnels excavated in the volcanic rock around Rome, originally used as quarries or drainage systems. The risk was immense. Being caught recovering the remains of an executed Christian meant joining them in the next session of games. Even so, they continued. The catacombs became the first Christian cemeteries, and more than that, they became secret churches, improvised hospitals, hiding places for fugitives. On the dark walls, by the light of flickering torches, the first expressions of Christian art emerged. Simple drawings of fish. The fish was a ciphered symbol, since the Greek letters for fish formed an acrostic for Jesus Christ, Son of God Savior. Anchors represented hope. Shepherds with sheep on their shoulders evoked the parable of the Good Shepherd. They were visual codes for a faith that could not be spoken in public. Some catacombs developed elaborate identification systems that functioned as a secret language. Christian families marked the tombs of their martyrs with specific symbols that only initiates would recognize. A palm meant victory, not military, but spiritual. A crown indicated that the deceased had finished the race, in the words of the Apostle Paul. Dates were recorded not by the official Roman calendar, but by the anniversary of death, called the day of birth, birth into eternal life. The language was inverted on purpose. What Rome called execution, the Christians called birth. What Rome called defeat, they called victory. What Rome called the end, they called the beginning, dimension the size of this phenomenon. The Roman catacombs extend for more than 150 kilometers of tunnels excavated in the rock. It is estimated that they house the remains of 500,000 to 750,000 people, the vast majority Christians from the first 4 centuries. Every body was a story, every improvised. Tomb was an act of silent resistance against the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The persecutions were not constant. There were periods of relative tolerance between moments of extreme violence, sometimes entire decades of peace. But when the persecutions came, they came with full force. Under Emperor Decius in 250 after Christ, an edict was issued requiring all citizens of the empire to perform public sacrifices to the Roman gods and obtain a certificate proving the act. Without the certificate, one could not buy, sell, work, or live normally. Those who refused were arrested immediately. The persecution of Decius lasted little more than a year, but it left a trail of thousands of dead and even more apostates, Christians who yielded to pressure and sacrificed to the gods to save their lives, generating a theological crisis over whether they could be readmitted to the community afterward. The last great persecution, and the most systematic of all, came under Diocletian, starting in 303 after Christ. Churches were demolished stone by stone, sacred scriptures were burned in public squares, clerics were arrested en masse. The imperial order was clear: eliminate Christianity once and for all, as if it had never existed. In some eastern provinces, the violence reached levels that even Roman officials considered excessive. The historian Eusebius of Caesarea, who lived during this period and witnessed the events personally, describes scenes of entire families executed together, children thrown to the beasts before their parents, tortures that extended for days before final death was granted as relief. And yet, the faith did not die. 10 years after the start of Diocletian's persecution, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313, granting religious freedom to Christians. In less than a century, Christianity would pass from a persecuted religion to the official religion of the Roman Empire. The temples of the old gods would be closed or converted into churches. The Colosseum would lose its original function. The games with executions of Christians would enter history as a closed chapter. How did a faith that seemed destined for extinction manage not only to survive, but to dominate the very empire that tried to destroy it? Part of the answer lies in those underground cells. It lies in the whispers of prayer when all seemed lost. It lies in the acts of forgiveness that defied all Roman logic of vengeance and honor. It lies in the disconcerting serenity before certain death. Every public execution that should have served as a warning transformed into involuntary testimony. Every martyr who died singing planted a question in the mind of those watching. What truth is this for which it is worth dying like this? The empire wanted to erase a faith. It used lions, fire, swords, and crowded arenas. It transformed executions into mass spectacle. It invested fortunes in the logistics of death, and it failed. Every public death generated more questions than answers. The question echoed in the streets of Rome long after the games ended, long after the sand was swept, long after the spectators returned to their homes. Today, the Colosseum is a ruin. The emperors became names in history books and statues in dusty museums, but the faith they tried to destroy spread to every continent on earth. There is an irony that history does not let escape. The ultimate symbol of Roman power became a point of pilgrimage for the spiritual heirs of those whom Rome threw to the lions. Each year, more than 7 million people visit the Colosseum. Many of them carry crosses around their necks. Sometimes what seems like absolute defeat is only the beginning of something that no empire can contain.